My name is Anita Carrasco, and I am an associate professor of anthropology here at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa. I want to extend a warm welcome to everyone joining us this evening from the Luther College community and the broader public. As part of Climate Justice Week, tonight we'll feature a presentation on the topic of climate change, anthropology and climate change, actions and transformations. Our speaker this evening will be Professor Susan Crate of George Mason University. Tonight's event is sponsored by the Center for Ethics and Public Engagement and the Center for Sustainable Communities at Luther College. The format for this evening will feature a 25-minute presentation by Professor Crate, followed by a Q&A period with you, the audience. If you're tuning in live to this event and would like to submit a question, please do so at any time by using the Q&A feature on Zoom. We will do our best to get to as many questions as possible. So let me now introduce our speaker. Susan Crate is a professor of anthropology in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at George Mason University in the United States. As an environmental and cognitive anthropologist, she has worked with indigenous communities in Siberia since 1988. Since 2005, her longitudinal ethnographic research with the Vilui Saha of northeastern Siberia has analyzed local perceptions, understandings, and responses to the local effects of climate change. Let me point out that she has worked with this community since 1995, and in 2005, she started focusing on climate change specifically. So about 30 years of engagement. Her research now focuses on operationalizing the engagement of the diversity of knowledge systems available in a given context to best understand how climate change was coming into local ecosystems and cultural worlds, and to develop effective responses and policy prescriptions. This research agenda has also expanded to Arctic Canada, Peru, Wales, Kiribati, Mongolia, and the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia. I would also like to mention that I've been teaching environmental anthropology at Luther for 10 years, and I've screened many documentaries for my students. However, as Professor Crate's documentary, The Anthropologist, that specifically focuses on climate change and its impacts on the indigenous peoples, has been the one that I feel has inspired my students the most. She's going to be showing some clips throughout her talk that are part of that larger documentary. So it's a pleasure to have Susie with us this evening, speaking as part of Climate Justice Week. Welcome, Susie.
Thank you very much, Anita, and thanks to everyone who made this presentation possible, and congratulations on your Climate Justice Week. You might wonder what anthropology has to do with climate justice. Well, it turns out that the climate is affecting people in marginalized regions of the world very differently from how it is affecting the broader public like ourselves. So anthropologists often go to study cultures who live in distant areas, high altitude, high latitude, or near sea level areas that are being inequitably affected by climate change today. And that's really what this documentary focuses on. And I must admit, when the company first approached me about being a part of this documentary, I was concerned about all the cameras and the human subjects issues, etc. But I also understood from about 15 years of working on climate change that we really needed new ways to communicate about it, that the science was too abstract for most people, and we really needed to bring a human face to it. And so I agreed. We began by going to my field site where I had been, as Anita said, I'd been working already for almost 20 years with these communities. The film crew came while we were conducting what we were calling knowledge exchanges. So having local people talk about their observations and having a regional scientist provide the communities with information about the local effects of climate change that they could actually understand, that was identifiable and relatable for them. So I want to just play a little bit of that for you right now with this clip.
Okay.
There's been a lot of studies charting, modeling, trying to understand climate change. The missing part is the human face.
Onu bolanda biga hakabet hedin korunları bu hakabet hede gece tahubu. İti zona korda korda bola hamay itiyi ulhanlık para turar hede bu biga hakabet hede o nasibir. Bitne bolanda te bir beton temperaturada kaydakmanlık külten gün hılta hıl bulurdu yühe dakika turar. Bu bolanda bu çırapçıga mayaga mega havaska usultanna ammaga bu abisne yapıyor. Injuganan bu manlık kirgisi ulakan situasyon.
Things happen in a particular environment, a tidal wave, a volcano, an epidemic. Every time there is a change is a moment to observe the human capacity to adapt.
Bilgin ite biya ka ayo ka betekar dia ta hagar kharamaitar kirat bol ite olo to ka hadenya ka yung kirat beratan ramanda ko labot hunta kaya
Diğer miktarlar bile küle miktarlar külümenle naha al-Bakhtari.
This is a fascinating thing to study for an anthropologist.
Olay 2 metrenin korduk diye korduk ühenden kostuna hamay kılgaskına. Eti antan bu bihide du turut hoğru du korduk tam mamanlar evini esker. Ama kanlara mamanlar hulanlar öskürtler. Oltuğundan toati.
In this clip, you saw the inhabitants of the area where I've done my research. They're Sakha. Non-Russian peoples lived there for over 500 years in these areas, and they're facing a lot of very dramatic changes in their climate. The landscape is changing because of the permafrost. Once the film crew finished doing a lot of shoots in this area, they then challenged me to think of 2 other places that I thought we should go. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, that there are what we could think of as these marginal areas of the planet, areas that are in the high latitude regions, as we are here in the Arctic. They are facing a much more rapid warming than the other parts of the planet. And of course, as you know, these are areas of the planet that are dependent upon there being ice. And without ice, basically those ecosystems cannot perpetuate themselves normally. High altitude areas also, we often know and hear increasingly about the loss of glacial mass. So the glaciers are dwindling, and we also hear a lot about near sea level areas, mostly because sea level is rising as the water in the ocean warms, it expands, but also from the melting of glaciers and other issues with the water cycles of the planet. So I said, well, why don't we go to visit a community in the near sea level areas and in the glacial areas. And that, I think, will give us a good understanding. So let me take you to a clip for Kiribati, which is in the sea level area. In terms of climate change, it's important to speak with elderly people because they've seen the most change. Have you lived here all your life?
Yes, most of my life
In this village?
I grew up here.
Okay, so when you were little,
Yeah.
how different was it from what you see now? There was
Big
no...
difference. That time was with the houses and everything beside them. It's kind of gradual. It comes
Yeah.
little by little.
How long has that been happening?
Say it's about almost 30 years now.
30 years.
Yes. Let's take a walk to where the broken seawall is.
It's made out of bags of cement.
Yes.
Just put bags of cement here, and then they just get wet and they turn into concrete.
Yeah.
But that must have been a pretty strong tide if it broke that.
When you see your land, where you live, when the land is broken, there's a shaking in the heart.
Yes.
Everywhere in the world, people encounter experiences that they wonder why that happened to them, why they can't do anything about it.
Tuwa aratabu. Tuwa nani. Tuwa aratabu aritsumea kayai. Ekarikia baka ngade. Dia baka kitakawa ya waririk. Artisana ba limia wakinna. Ila nondirikia ika bakana.
Resignation is one way of coping.
Ngai dena sina ruta kina pagi. Age di bas pon ngoro yang ngai da ka inte bugina. Ya pun ka kan tani kana da dai to we. Masira ante ha.
You can't do much except mourn.
What do you think of the problems here with the seawall?
So many people in the United States can't get their head around climate change.
You remember coming here when it was a meeting house?
I'm wondering whether seeing people that live by the sea when it's rising makes people realize we're all going to have to change.
Kids are really interesting to photograph.
Okay, so we did spend more time in Kiribati. The next trip we took was to the high altitude area. We were choosing between the Himalayas and the Andes in Peru, and we went to Peru. I had a longtime colleague, Patricia Hammer, who has a center up there near Juarez. And so she invited us up to come and to interact with the communities there. And this was important also because Peru is an area of the world that is very high in agrobiodiversity. So a lot of our food crops come from these regions in Peru. It's a very intensive farming area. The farming is practiced in a very latitudinal way, I guess we could say. Farmers often have fields between 7,000 and 14,000 feet, and they grow different crops at those different elevations. So let me give you a little sense of what the communities. I did also want to mention the elderly woman in this is Margaret Mead's daughter, Catherine Bateson. And that's important. The Margaret Mead aspect of this didn't come in until towards the end of creating the film. We wanted to draw the parallels between what anthropologists were looking at her time and what they're looking at now. And I'll trick you into seeing the whole film, because in order to understand that aspect of it, you're going to have to see the whole film. I can't show all of that tonight. So let's go to the Andes, where we can learn a little bit about the communities and what they are challenged by in terms of climate change and the glaciers that they depend upon.
You're going to have cold temperatures.
There are these canals that were pre-Incan.
People are directing this water into the fields. The water comes from the glaciers, melting during the warmer part of the year and throwing back during the colder time. As the earth warms, the glaciers are losing their mass. Nice to meet you. Buenos dias. This is my daughter, Katie.
We use 85% of all the water in agriculture.
Cesar came to Juarez as a civil engineer, building dams in these high areas.
Some samples of the work that we did.
He's kind of become a glaciologist by default.
And our glaciers are disappearing as everywhere.
I asked him when the glaciers would be completely gone.
The big water crisis will be in 2030.
2030.
Yes, because the big masses of ice have already gone.
Okay, and then one more clip I want to show you from this area of the world. We traveled up into the elevations and talked with a farmer up there, and that's what I want to show you now.
Claro, desde muy antes sembramos papa, trigo, maíz, señorita, pero solamente maíz también producía en parte bajo.
Farmers grow the crops higher and higher because it's getting warmer. As far as I can tell, there's not much higher ground to go to.
¿Por acá sigue sembrando esas papas?
Sí, poco ya, señorita, sembramos, pero esas variedades ya no ya. Ya no da como para conche poeta.
He's going to need to find alternatives to think out of the box.
He's remembering when he was a child that used to be all covered with ice. Every year you see that it's receding more and more.
Una parte pienso todo esto porque cuando Adán perdió su eje con Dios, le maldijo a la tierra.
He's an evangelist, so he's talking, he's giving kind of a religious explanation.
The farmers talked about how it was the end of the world, and that's it.
All the time, you're not just collecting separate facts. You're thinking these things weave together. Together, they make a way of life.
And so after we had traveled to these three areas of the world, I mentioned to the filmmakers, why don't we go somewhere in the United States? I mean, don't we also want to help people here understand that this isn't just something happening in these faraway places, in these cultures where many people will never go. We want to bring it more home to people. I had done a project a few years earlier on the Chesapeake Bay, working with watermen. Watermen are traditional crab and oyster harvesters who have practiced their trade for hundreds of years on the Chesapeake Bay. And so we made a trip there. And that's the clip I'd like to show you now.
And I remember Back in the 70s, seeing ice floating right here in the York River, 2.5, 3 foot high. Well, that was the last time that I saw that.
No ice like that since then?
No, I've never seen no ice like that. No. I don't believe it's as cold as what it used to be. Now, whether that has anything to do with global warming or not, I don't know.
I've done work in Siberia, right?
Anthropologists converse. You ask people about their lives.
1991.
You hang out.
Just like you, they know their environment really well because they work in it.
Well, I see some changes that I don't know whether it's just happening now or it's been gradually happening over the years. There used to be a time when we were fishing and catch 2,000 pound of lobster a trip. They're non-existent off here now.
Is this too warm?
I guess so. They very rarely do they catch any.
Get people to tell you the myths and the religious beliefs.
As far as the global warming, it is really hard to believe in something that you can't see or touch. It is really hard to believe in it.
But you believe in God?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so where does... I can't see or touch God.
I know, but...
But how do you...
I agree that man is probably causing it, but the Lord is letting them do it. He'll let them destroy their own self, because he said you won't tell the seasons apart before the end of time. I mean, that's in the Bible.
Huh.
So all along this trajectory, I guess we could say, of meeting these communities, of interacting with these different cultures, of understanding how they're being challenged and affected by the local effects of climate change, from thinking about the Saha, who live in northeastern Siberia, one of the coldest inhabited places on the planet, and how they are noticing, because they're so familiar with their environment, because they need to be familiar with their environment in order to make a living. They breed horses and cattle. They have to know the environmental conditions. And so that very intimate knowledge that they have is the reason why they are able to say to us that things are changing. So they have what we could call indigenous knowledge. It's not the scientific knowledge. They're not out there measuring precipitation, measuring temperatures. They know in their own specific expertise. The communities, of course, on Kiribati, for them, it's also very obvious that things are different. They're seeing the island atoll. There are 30 islands that make up the nation state of Kiribati, where they've lived again for centuries. And they're witnessing those islands gradually going under the water. And then, of course, in the Peruvian Andes, where you can see their dependence upon that glacial water. It's not just a dependence for those communities in the mountains. You can see how they depend on it for their agricultural use, et cetera. But that glacial water is very important to Lima, the capital of Peru, and to all of the coastal populated areas of Peru. So this is more than just affecting these immediate communities that we're talking about. And with the watermen, of course, you can see this one gentleman. I'm not sure if you could understand, he had a pretty heavy accent, but he talked about how they used to get 2,000 pounds of lobster out of the Chesapeake Bay. That's amazing. I have never even heard of lobster coming from the Chesapeake Bay. That tells us that the waters are getting much, much warmer. This is important information, these local knowledge systems, these indigenous knowledge systems. So what happens towards the end of the film, and the way that we try to link all of these disparate pieces together, these knowledge systems, these local observations, is we show a specific piece where we're discussing these changes with a Catholic priest in Peru. And I'll play that right now and then make a few more comments after the end of that.
Priest said the people who go up to the glacier are valued.
Nosotros somos humanos, entonces llega para nosotros. Aceptar todas las inclemencias de la naturaleza. El frío, el cambio brusco del clima.
He understood climate change like an anthropologist, that it's going to take nothing less than a cultural transformation.
De cielo. Es un hecho que se puede comprobar.
The Lord is letting them do it.
La idea de asumir
Le maldijo a la tierra.
que la tierra se acaba, está en uno mismo. En cuanto a lo espiritual, lo cristiano, siempre todo es cambiante, ¿no? Se transforma. Un mensaje como un llamamiento a la conciencia de poder asumir estas pruebas, ¿no? Pruebas que se vienen, que pueden venir y siempre vendrán.
So I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now because the clips are over with, but I would like to just in closing, I guess, of this little section before we move into questions, I do have to say that I believe my decision to participate in this documentary was a good one. I've gotten a lot of positive feedback from people who have seen it. It seems to work to be able to show how people are being affected in their daily lives. It gives a human face to climate change. It gives us the kind of almost emotional empathy that we need to have, I think, to really understand beyond what numbers and graphs and projections and models can tell us. So I'd like to hear your questions, and I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that super presentation. The clips you picked were just perfect. I mean, I've seen the entire documentary, and I really appreciated how you circled back to the United States, you know, sort of as a reminder that this is not a problem that is not our problem. It's everyone's problem. So thank you for that. So we are now officially in the Q&A section. So I'm going to start asking some questions from the public. The first question is, are there other areas in the United States you'd like to study?
Well, certainly we know that in the United States, all of the coastal areas, we, of course, hear a lot about the coastal areas that are hit with these more powerful storms, hurricanes that have been coming through that are not caused by climate change, but are intensified because the warming of the ocean, et cetera, makes them much stronger and much more powerful. And of course, the flooding is a huge issue. But there's also areas, dry areas are now getting drier. Of course, the whole problem with the forest fires, which are intensified. In Colorado, I was out there probably 5 years ago screening the film, and a first responder fire person got up and talked about that fire is a natural part of the ecosystem out there. There is a fire season. What has happened now with climate change is that fire season has expanded by about 8 months. I mean, the fire stays going under the ground, et cetera. So again, climate change can be thought of something that exacerbates existing ecosystem conditions like dryness, like a fire season, like humidity, dampness, et cetera. But I think the most important would be to work in parts in terms of climate change effects, of course, Alaska is part of the United States, and Alaska, being in the Arctic, is facing immense amounts of coastal erosion. Coastal communities are having to literally relocate inland and leave behind their ancestral lands where they've lived for hundreds of years, if not more. So I think the other important piece of studying, as you know, anthropologists study just about anything that has to do with people. And back in Margaret Mead's time, the tendency was to go to these far distant places to study cultures that were very different from ours, speaking of the academics who would go to study them. Now, anthropologists are doing studies of cultures everywhere, even virtual cultures. So I think it's very important for anthropologists to study the cultures in the United States who continue to not understand climate change and be able to find ways to communicate effectively so that they do understand that this is a problem that affects us all.
Okay, thank you. The next question is by Salome. She's a student, and she would like to know what will be your message of hope for people who want to keep fighting for climate justice. It's a big one.
Well, I think there is so much hope in the young people. Like you, Salomon is her name?
Salome.
Salome, yes. So with the Sunrise Movement and all of the Greta Thunberg movement, everyone who's been actively involved, I think the next generation, in fact, I didn't play this clip, but at the very end of the film, as my daughter is going off to college, I talk about how I believe that it's going to be her generation who are going to turn things around. And it's not that I am just kind of, here, it's yours, take it. Sorry, we messed it up so badly. That's not the attitude I have. I believe that the generation, young people in their teens and 20s right now, are the ones who have the gumption to really say, no more. And so that's where I find the hope. I also believe that in terms of justice is concerned, it is unjust in terms of how climate change is affecting populations. It's very similar to if we think about how COVID is inequitably affecting populations. And so I think that people are getting very articulate and successful at demanding justice. So that's where I find hope.
Thank you. Another question is by a student as well, Kirsten, and she wants to know, how would you suggest we support and advocate for these marginalized communities that are being so affected by climate change? Do you have any suggestions of organizations or other educational materials?
Well, certainly there are organizations. Cultural Survival is an organization that's been around for decades. I haven't been that familiar with them recently in terms of climate change. I'm very familiar with the Arctic groups that are working with Indigenous groups in the Arctic, only because that's been my main focus of my research. But there is the UNESCO has a strong arm working with Indigenous groups. The Arctic Council has an entire representation by the Indigenous peoples of that area. And I'm sure there's other groups. I can often also send you more ideas, Anita, later, and you can share them with the students.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question is anonymous. It says, the Indigenous knowledge you talk about seems to be disregarded in many discussions about climate change because they do not provide raw scientific data. Could you talk about the importance of this Indigenous knowledge in addressing climate change?
Certainly. So if we accept the fact that ever since the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, began its work in 1990, they have, since 1990, the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change has generated these assessment reports. They're right now working on publishing the 6th assessment, and basically it's a international effort to bring together the most relevant science, the most up-to-date science, to give us a gauge of how climate change is affecting the Earth system. And in the very early years, it was very much focused on hard scientific knowledge, so on measurements, temperatures, models, graphs, tables, projections, etc. And over time, they have started to understand that, gee, humans are part of this whole equation. And humans actually do things on the ground and decide to change their behavior or not, and decide to adapt or not, and etc. So they began to bring in the human aspect and started to have sections of the assessments about adaptation and resilience, etc. And then in the special reports that came out just a couple of years ago, I was lead author on one of them. We actually brought Indigenous knowledge and science and local knowledge into the report in a framing way. So the reason it's important, why is it important? Well, if we only think about the scientific data, then we're looking at the Earth as a very mechanical, robotic structure, right? We're leaving out the cultural diversity, we're leaving out the various ways that all these diverse human populations have of interacting with their environment, of knowing their environment, naming their environment. We're leaving out the diversity of languages and the way people interact. Many of these Indigenous communities that we're speaking of understand themselves as being a part of the natural world as opposed to science, which is standing outside of it and looking in a very separate, objective, quote unquote, way. So the power of these knowledge systems and of local knowledge, as I hope you saw also in the clips, scientific knowledge can give us a very generalized kind of top-down view of what's happening to the planet. These Indigenous knowledge systems and these local knowledge systems give us that very detailed and intimate information about how exactly that overall global change is impacting and interacting at the ground level with the people who are there and how they're responding.
Thank you. Another student, Catherine Donahue, wants to know, how can we encourage Indigenous knowledge to be valued more in scientific and academic communities? I think you kind of answered this with what you mentioned about the report incorporating Indigenous knowledge. But she also has another question within that question that says, how can we incorporate more Indigenous knowledge into policy? So maybe I can add, other than what you did and you mentioned in the previous response, have you seen any attempts or efforts to incorporate more Indigenous knowledge in other scientific venues?
Well, beyond the IPCC, I mean, increasingly it's happening. The big international biodiversity effort, I forget, IPBES, I think is the acronym, IPBES. Anyway, there is a big, also like IPCC, but it's focusing on biodiversity. They also, in the last few years, have really brought Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge into their assessments. So it's happening. And as Indigenous people become, as Indigenous communities become, exercise their agency more, which is happening, and are able to, really be present and be at the table and represent themselves more and more. I believe that this is just going to be happening as a result of that. It's got to.
Yeah. Okay. Dr. Kevin Sand is asking if it's possible for the general public to access the entire film. It's very compelling, and he'd like to show it within the Decorah community. I know that Luther College has like a license, so students and faculty can access it, but I'm not sure how that would be for the Decorah community. So where can people get access to your film, Susan?
Yeah, so what you need to do is go to the website for the film company. Their name is Ironbound Films. Iron like the metal, bound, all one word. And on there, you can find the film. It's one of course, many of their documentaries that they've made. And there will be information there of how you can access it. I'm pretty sure that you can access it online. It used to be available on several of the streaming services. And then there's also information there of how you can purchase it. Are you looking that up right now, or are you looking at questions?
No, I'm looking, I'm monitoring questions.
Sorry, I'm used to being on Zoom with people who are like, when I say something, they start looking it up.
No.
Yeah, okay.
I'm not that. Okay, so there's a student, Audra, and she wants to know, in your field, what are some of the successes you have seen in the climate change movement, and what forms of activism seem to work the best?
Oh my. Well, I think that anytime that local people represent themselves and let their situation be known, it's a success. And I think that, for example, we show in the film, we go down to Washington, D.C. It was back when there was a protest about the pipeline. It was, of course, during the Obama administration, and we show that. And of course, the Dakota Access Pipeline has been a success in terms of preventing that. So I think there is a lot of power if people stand up for what they know is right. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. You introduced your daughter in one clip. Can you talk a little bit about traveling with her? How did the experience impact her?
So my daughter is, she's actually, I actually married a Saha man, and she is, of course, from that area of Siberia via her dad. And she has pretty much, her first trip to Siberia, she was 6 months old. So she has traveled pretty much all of her life. We've gone back, of course, practically every summer on our research projects. And we've done a lot of traveling, of course, until last year. She was extremely interested in going on this trip. She knows 5 languages. She's very worldly, I would say. She's in her master's degree at UT Austin right now. Of course, she's here taking classes. Was the question about how well she traveled?
No, how the experience impacted her.
Oh, it impacted her a lot. Going to these other places that she had not been before, witnessing firsthand the challenges for people, on top of meeting people and becoming friends with people and feeling the empathy for their situation. I think it impacted her greatly.
So how has the pandemic affected the work of anthropologists as well as those working in climate change? Or how it has affected your work? Maybe.
Well, it's affected me because I am used to traveling a lot, and I haven't gone anywhere since March 17th when I came back from a fellowship in Australia because of the pandemic, March 17th, 2020. So a year and a month ago, practically. It makes it difficult. I have a Fulbright Arctic Initiative grant right now. I was supposed to go up to the Yukon, Canada to do some comparative work. There's another scientist up there who's working with local communities who are dealing with permafrost degradation and the land basically falling in, and they're doing mapping, and we were going to be doing some work there. I have several students who are unable to go and do their research for their dissertation and their masters. So it's complicated, but there are ways to, one of my students is interviewing people and doing interviews over Zoom. It's not ideal, but it can be done. And I think, we're anthropologists are an adaptable group. Hopefully this will be over and we'll be able to get back to some semblance of what it used to be like. But I think for me, it's been a very humbling experience. It makes me very appreciative of the ability that we used to have to travel and to literally get in each other's faces in terms of talking to each other and interacting. So I think it's, yeah.
It's been hard. So you talked about being hesitant to participate in a documentary, but might you consider another? If so, what would you like to highlight or do different?
Well, I think it would be good to do The Anthropologist too. Go back to those places that we were in, or go to new places. Find a way, find an angle, that's relevant now. I mean, the filming started in 2010. We pretty much finished it up by 2013, the filming part of it. So, we could do something 10 years later that would give a sense of how things have gone, or go to places where, there's a new level. Yeah. The answer to the question is yes, I would love to do another, because I feel like this was very effective. And the Ironbound group, I think, Anita, you were correct. They have made another documentary that I was familiar with, The Linguists, which is also done in a similar way, where they travel with two scientists who are both linguists and go to these communities that they work with, and then they go to other parts of the world where languages are threatened and have them interact with the communities there. So I think it's I like the way this documentary came out, because so many documentaries you end up just kind of depressed at the end of them, and this has it's a very heavy topic, and it's very hard to think about the challenges that these people have, but they have a way of putting it together where it's light in a way, and it brings you out thinking there's hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you ever get a sense that the people you talked with were resentful of the people and behaviors that are contributing to climate change?
To be honest, I didn't. And of course, I know they ought to be, because the people that are most affected are the ones who are the least responsible for generating greenhouse gas emissions. I think it was clear in some of the clips you heard these references to God and these references to this is this is, well, the evangelical gentleman in Peru was talking about how this was the divine fault, or I forget the exact terminology. So amongst these communities, there's not the awareness of, oh, this is global warming. What is happening? The atmosphere is filling with greenhouse gases. Those greenhouse gases are trapping the sun's heat, keeping the earth warmer. That warmed atmosphere is coming into the climate, the earth system, and causing these changes across the planet. This is not obviously how most of the people we interacted with think about climate change. They understand it, again, through their local and indigenous knowledge systems. They know it directly because of the plants and the animals and the timing of the rains and the warmth or the coldness of the season, whatever the season is, are different from it's always been all their lives. The glacier is disappearing. The water is less. The water is more when we're talking about the South Pacific. So there is not that, I'm not saying that no one in these communities knows about this scientific explanation and exactly the fact that, you know, the United States, 4% of the world's population generates 25% of the greenhouse gases. But, you know, I imagine there might be a few people, but the majority of the people that we're working with don't have that awareness.
Mm-hmm. I don't think we have time for too many questions, but I do have one because you mentioned at the beginning when you said why you did the documentary, even though you were hesitating. And you mentioned the question of we need to do things better. Clearly, writing books is not doing it, at least, you know, in terms of reaching a broader audience and raising awareness. I imagine you went in those lines. And so I agree with you that we have to continue to do a better job in thinking of ways to communicate these findings and the impacts and how people cope and what we can do different, right? And so would you like to elaborate a little bit on why that became important to you? You know, finding a different way of talking about it.
Well, in 2007, in addition to my other work, I also trained with Al Gore. He trained 1,000 people to give his slideshow. The idea was that all these people would be trained to give his slideshow, and they'd go all around the country, and suddenly everybody would understand and they'd get it and everything would change. Mm-hmm. But that didn't happen. And my own experience, I was trained, I gave 35 community presentations, and the science is just too abstract. People look at these numbers and these graphs and blah, blah, blah, blah. People need something that actually brings about an emotion in them. They need to feel climate change. They need to understand that it is part of their world, that it is in their lives somehow. So for me, I've found the best way. In fact, many times when I screen the film, during the Q&A, after I answer a few questions, I ask the audience what kinds of things they've been seeing. And often these audiences are local communities. You know, they're people who live relatively near each other. When I screened it, for example, in Alexandria, Virginia, a few years ago, I asked, and people talked about remembering skating on the Potomac River. I mean, how long has it been since you've been able to skate on the Potomac River? So I believe in these kinds of contexts where people can come together and in a way they start talking about things that perhaps they've been thinking about themselves, but never really took the time to converse with other people about. And they start saying, oh yeah, well, that's true. 10 years ago, this was like this and that was like that. And it's a kind of a cathartic process where people can come to an understanding about climate change and realize that it's a real thing. And it's not this kind of highly politicized issue that it has come to be in this country. So I think more and more that the important piece of this is to find ways to communicate via this almost narrative process where you can appeal to people through a narrative about climate change, whether it's a documentary like this, where you're giving a narrative about other people's lives and their challenges because of climate change, or some other parable or story that you can actually bring to people in some performative way, and then bring people into conversation and interaction about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I really like how you phrased it. People need to feel climate change. Mm-hmm. And I think you're exactly right on that. And it's going to be a challenge for us, trained in academia, to kind of think outside the box more, because it's crucial to make sure that people start feeling this. Is there anything that we didn't ask that you would like to comment on, as a closing comment, any message that you would like to send us off with? Something we didn't ask, maybe. Yeah.
Well, I think it's important for people to understand that, yes, this is a huge issue. And yes, it's challenging to think about it, especially if you start reading about the projections and blah, blah, blah. But I want people to know that we can do this. I think we're very sort of used to having a one-way fix of something. Let's just fix it, or let's leave it to them to do it. But I think it's Naomi Klein in her books talks about how climate change, yes, it's challenging, but it's actually an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to come together. It's an opportunity for us to reconnect with each other and with the planet in profound ways. So I would especially like young people. I know that it probably can be difficult to think about what is before you in terms of your lifetime and these changes. But I want you to know that there is hope, that you can get connected with the other young people who are working on this. I remember when I actually first got climate change, it was in the early 90s. And I had gone to a presentation by David Orr, who taught at Oberlin. I'm not sure he's still there or not. And somehow his presentation, I just got it. And at the time, I was very shaken by it. I didn't want to drive a car. I didn't want to do anything that had to do with generating carbon. And I wrote to him and I said, thank you so much, but what do I do? And he said, find other people who are working on this issue, working towards positive change, and enjoy the beautiful fall weather. We're not here to suffer and to, just work all the time. We're alive on the planet, and that's part of what's going to heal this. So that's what I'd like to say.
Yeah, well, I want to, thank you for sharing your ideas with us and your feelings too. And it's a privilege, to have been able to hear you even with COVID and all. So, or maybe thanks to COVID. And I also want to thank everyone who tuned in this evening. And we hope that you found the conversation, all of us, very fruitful and constructive. And have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.